December 14th, 1944. Honuli internment camp, territory of Hawaii. The air was thick, smelling of damp wool and the distant salt of the Pacific. Captain Kenji Tanaka kept his eyes fixed on the mud by his feet, waiting for the inevitable bark, perhaps the shove. The morning roll call was a ritual of degradation. He felt the weight of his tattered officer's cap, the last thread of his identity, clinging damply to his skull. Boots stopped. Silence stretched, taut and heavy. He forced his gaze upward, bracing for the Oni, the demon. He met the eyes of a young American private, barely old enough to shave. The American's hand did not move to his baton. It snapped upward, fingers rigid, palm slicing the humid air in a perfect regulation salute. It was aimed not at Kenji's face, but at the frayed brim of his cap. Kenji's breath hitched. It was not hatred, it was respect. 8 weeks earlier, the capture off the coast of Oahu. The sea had been a violent memory, churning gray and white. Salt still caked Kenji's eyebrows, stinging his skin, but the transport truck offered a new, suffocating misery. Humid air, thick with the smell of diesel and mold. 8 weeks earlier, the destroyer's hull had looked like the side of a steel mountain rising from the Pacific. Now, there was only red mud and barbed wire, swallowed by a jungle that steamed under the Hawaiian sun. Honuli. The name meant nothing. It was just the end. Captain Kenji Tanaka stood, shivering despite the heat, in a long line of captured men. This was it, the conclusion of his honor. The propaganda films had been clear, repeated by his superiors, until they were gospel. The Americans were Oni, white-skinned demons who took no prisoners, only specimens for torture and grotesque experimentation. He had failed his emperor by failing to die in battle. This, he knew, was his punishment. The processing line moved with a brutal, indifferent efficiency. Strip! The English word was sharp, unmistakable. He removed his salt-stiffened uniform, item by item. It felt less like disrobing and more like being flayed. His identity, his rank, his very personhood peeled away with the cloth. Finally, all that remained was his officer's cap. He held it for a half second, the fabric frayed at the brim where his thumb always gripped it. He let it fall to the muddy ground with the rest of his uniform, bracing for the kick, the laugh, the butt of a rifle. Nothing came. They were herded through a doorway, the air suddenly cold and smelling overpoweringly of lye and chemical disinfectant. A stinging, pressurized spray hit his skin. Kenji closed his eyes, his mind detaching, waiting for the real pain to begin. This was the prelude, the cleaning before the butchery. But the spray stopped. He was shoved back out into the humid air, naked and dripping, toward a pile of clothing. A different soldier, this one with a thick neck and corporal stripes, manned the station. He threw a set of rough, olive-drab fatigues at Kenji. Kenji caught them, the fabric abrasive against his chemically scoured skin. The corporal pointed with his chin at the muddy pile Kenji had left behind. Rank? Kenji hesitated, his throat tight. Captain, the corporal grunted. He kicked the soiled uniform aside, then bent down. He picked up the tattered officer's cap. Kenji's stomach tightened into a cold knot. The corporal looked at the simple metal insignia, then at Kenji. He held it for a long moment, and Kenji saw the future. The demon crushing the symbol in his fist, grinding it into the mud as a final act of desecration. Instead, the corporal tossed the cap onto the clean fatigues in Kenji's arms. "Don't lose it," the American said, his voice flat, bored, not cruel. Kenji stared at the cap. He did not understand. He snatched it, pulling it close, expecting the soldier to laugh, to reveal the punchline of the joke. The soldier had already turned to the next man. He was pushed toward a new section of the camp. Officers, this way. Enlisted, that way. They were being separated. This too was wrong. Barbarians did not observe military protocol. They did not honor the separation of rank. They annihilated it. He was guided into a long wooden barracks. It smelled of damp wood, sweat, and the faint, lingering odor of the disinfectant. He found an empty bunk, sinking onto the thin mattress. The fear was still present, a cold stone in his gut. But it was no longer pure terror. It was now poisoned by a profound, agonizing confusion. He was alive. He was unharmed. And clutched tightly in his hand, smelling of salt and lye, was his cap. Darkness still clung to the corners of the barracks when the whistle shrieked. It was a piercing, metallic sound that sliced through the humid air, dragging Kenji from a shallow, restless state that was not truly sleep. He sat up. The rough wool blanket scratched his chin. Around him, the other officers moved with a grim, silent resignation. This was it, the morning ritual. In the Imperial Army, roll call was a ceremony of precision, discipline, and communal honor. Here, Kenji assumed, it was a stage for degradation. He reached for his officer's cap, which he had placed carefully on the floor beside his bunk. His fingers brushed the frayed brim. He had kept it, slept near it, a talisman against the Oni. He settled it low on his brow. It was thin, damp fabric, but it felt like the last piece of armor he possessed. They filed out into the pre-dawn chill. The air was cold against his newly shorn scalp, carrying the smell of wet earth, the sulfur of the camp stoves, and the distant latrines. A thick mist hung low to the ground, blurring the edges of the compound and swallowing the tops of the guard towers. It muffled the sound of their boots on the gravel path as they formed ranks. Kenji stood straight, his chin up, his eyes forward. He focused his mind, channeling every precept of the Bushido. Do not show fear. Do not show weakness. Accept the inevitable blow with dignity. He prepared his spirit to be broken, and resolved to deny the enemy the satisfaction of seeing it break. He saw the American guards approach through the mist. They moved differently than the Japanese soldiers he knew. A loose-limbed, almost lazy gait, yet their rifles were held at a ready, efficient port. Kenji focused on the man in charge, a sergeant, identifiable by the stripes on his sleeve. The sergeant held a clipboard and a pencil. He stopped in front of their rank. Kenji braced himself, his muscles tensing. He stared at a point just past the man's shoulder, preparing for the shout, the intrusive inspection meant to find fault, the random selection for punishment. The sergeant's voice was flat, bored. Tanaka. Kenji stiffened, the sound of his name a shock. Here. Okada. Here. Endo. Here. The sergeant continued down the line, his pencil making small, precise ticks on the paper. He did not look at their faces. He did not check their uniforms. He did not bark or spit or shove. He was just counting. Kenji felt a single bead of sweat, shockingly cold in the morning air, trace a path down his temple. It stopped at the worn leather sweatband of his cap. He had prepared his mind for agony, his body for impact. He was met with bookkeeping. The sergeant reached the end of the line. He made a final mark, grunted to himself, and turned to the guards. All present, officers' barracks. He tucked the clipboard under his arm and walked away, his boots crunching on the gravel, disappearing back into the fog. The whistle blew again. Dismissed. Kenji stood frozen for a moment, the breath trapped in his lungs. The tension, coiled so tightly in his chest, had nowhere to go. It left him feeling hollow, almost dizzy. He looked at the other officers. They, too, wore masks of profound bewilderment. They turned wordlessly and walked back into the barracks. It was over. He was unharmed. He was not degraded. He was merely accounted for. Kenji sat on his bunk, his hands trembling slightly. He removed his cap and stared at it. He had expected the demons to rage and roar. He had not expected them to be accountants. This bureaucratic indifference was more disorienting than the cruelty he had steel-caged his mind to endure. Kenji sat on his bunk for a long time after returning to the barracks. The brief, anticlimactic ritual of the roll call had left an intellectual vacuum, and his propaganda-fueled terror rushed in to fill it. If they did not torture, it was because they had found a more efficient way to destroy the spirit. He looked around the long, dim room. The air was musty, smelling of green wood, sweat, and the faint, ever-present humidity of the island. Other officers were settling into the grim routine. Major Hino, an older man from the infantry, sat cross-legged on his bunk, his eyes closed. Propped on the small shelf beside him was a small, dog-eared photograph of a woman and 2 children. Kenji's gaze shifted. Captain Endo, a naval officer whose spectacles had miraculously survived the capture, was carefully polishing the lenses with a scrap of cloth. Kenji looked down at his own hands. They held the officer's cap. This was the source of his profound disorientation. The photograph, the spectacles, his cap. These were not tools of survival. They were relics of identity. Barbarians, the Oni of the war posters, did not permit identity. They eradicated it. They would have burned the photograph, snapped the spectacles, and ground the cap into the mud. The corporal's gesture replayed in his mind. Don't lose it, not a threat, a flat, bureaucratic instruction. Kenji examined the cap closely, turning it over in the thin light. The fabric was stiff, coarse with dried salt, and the lingering chemical smell of the delousing spray. The simple metal star of his rank was dull, tarnished by the sea. He ran a thumb over the frayed brim, a nervous habit from a life that now seemed to belong to another man. This cap had sat on his head as he studied charts of the Pacific. It had shaded his eyes as he'd watched the coastline of Oahu grow fatally distinct. It was the last object to have touched his full, proper uniform. Its presence was an accusation. It was the symbol of his rank, and he had failed that rank by being captured. Shame, hot and sharp, washed over him. The survivor's guilt that every captured soldier carried. He should have died with his men. Instead, he was here, breathing, fed, and inexplicably holding the very symbol of his failed duty. And the Americans had given it back. This contradiction was the real torture. It was a riddle he could not solve. If they respected the symbols of his rank, did they respect the rank itself? If they respected the rank, did they respect the man? The logic was impossible, a snake eating its own tail. He noticed a small tear in the seam near the insignia where the fabric had been pulled taut. A single thread hung loose. From the pocket of his new POW fatigues, he retrieved the small mending kit from his original uniform. Another item inexplicably returned to him. His fingers, still stiff and clumsy from the tension, fumbled with the needle. He pulled a length of dark thread and slowly, almost furtively, began to repair the damage. It was a small, quiet act in the dim barracks. It was an act of defiance, not against his captors, but against the narrative that said he was already dead. He was not a ghost. He was not a number. He was Captain Kenji Tanaka. Each stitch was a tiny anchor, pulling the fabric of his broken identity back together. He finished the repair. The seam was uneven, ugly, but it was strong. He held the cap up, studying his work. Tomorrow, at the morning roll call, he would wear it. He would not hide it. He would wear it properly, as an officer. It was no longer a shield against an expected blow. It was a question. He would place this symbol of his rank before them, and he would wait to see how they answered. 3 weeks passed. The camp settled into a rhythm that was less terrifying than Kenji had anticipated, and more profoundly monotonous. The morning roll call lost its agonizing tension. It was now merely a cold formality, the bureaucratic counting of bodies. Kenji wore his officer's cap to every formation, the repaired seam a small, private validation. No guard ever mentioned it. The rules of the camp, contrary to propaganda, were becoming clear. They were based on the Geneva Convention, a document Kenji had only vaguely heard of. Officers were not required to work. However, voluntary work details were available, tending the vast vegetable gardens that fed the camp, or maintaining the gravel pathways. Participation offered access to canteen coupons, scrip for small luxuries like cigarettes, extra soap, or occasionally chocolate from the Red Cross. Kenji volunteered, not for the coupons, but for the information. To work outside the officers' barracks was to see the camp's true mechanics, to observe the other guards. This Tuesday, the heat was a physical weight. The Hawaiian sun beat down relentlessly, and the rich volcanic soil smelled of damp minerals and fertilizer. Kenji, his trousers rolled to his shins, knelt by a row of tomato plants, methodically pulling weeds. The cap on his head was a functional necessity, its brim, damp with his sweat, shielding his eyes from the glare. A new guard was supervising the detail. He was young, perhaps 19 or 20, with a sharp jaw and eyes that never stopped moving. His uniform was crisper than the others, his posture rigid. His voice, when he directed the enlisted men working in an adjacent field, was loud and clear, carrying easily in the humid air. The other prisoners called him Private Miller. Kenji watched him from beneath the brim of his cap. This soldier was different from the bored, indifferent men who ran the roll call. Miller moved with a purpose that felt like tightly coiled energy. He walked the perimeter of the garden, his boots precise, his rifle held at a perfect angle. This, Kenji thought, his stomach tightening, is the one. This was the true Oni. The boredom of the others was a facade. This man was the genuine article, the true believer in the war, the one who harbored the hatred Kenji had been trained to expect. Kenji kept his head down, focusing on the weeds, but his attention was fixed entirely on the guard. He pulled a stubborn root, and as he looked up to wipe the sweat from his brow, he found Miller looking directly at him. Kenji froze. He had been caught staring. This was the moment. The pretense of civility would drop. The shout, the shove, the blow from a rifle butt. It would come now, for the insolence of looking. Private Miller's expression did not change. He did not smile, nor did he scowl. He simply held Kenji's gaze for a long second. Then Miller lifted his chin, jerking it slightly toward the boundary fence, perhaps 20 yards away. It was not a threat. It was a simple, nonverbal order. Mind your boundary. Don't look at me. Look at your work. Then Miller turned and continued his patrol. Kenji let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. He looked back down at the red soil, his heart hammering. The gesture had been cold, yes. Impersonal, absolutely. But it had not been brutal. It was not the act of a demon seeking to inflict pain. It was the act of a guard maintaining discipline. It was the precise detached action of a soldier. Kenji grabbed another weed. He recognized the cold professionalism. He had seen it in his own NCOs. He had practiced it himself. He realized with a disquieting lurch that he did not fear Private Miller. He understood him. It happened during the lull after the meager midday meal. The barracks was hot, the air thick with the smell of boiled potatoes and inactivity. Captain Endo, the naval officer with the spectacles, returned from his brief work detail in the mess hall, where he had volunteered to wash pots. He moved with a stiff, agitated energy that silenced the low conversations around him. He did not sit on his bunk. He stood in the center aisle, pulling something from beneath his damp fatigue shirt. It was a folded, Slightly greasy sheet of newspaper. Contraband. The officers gathered immediately, forming a tight, anxious circle. Endo's hands trembled, not from fear, but from a quiet, cold fury. He spread the paper, a page from the Honolulu Star Bulletin, on his bunk. "What is it?" Major Hino asked, his voice a low growl. "A letter," Endo whispered, his English precise from his pre-war studies. "A letter. To the editor. From a citizen." He began to translate, his voice barely audible, yet every word landed like a stone. The letter was from a woman, a Navy wife. She wrote of the sacrifices of our boys fighting in the Pacific, of the rationing back home, of the sons who would never return. And then her tone turned to venom. "And yet," Endo translated, his jaw tight, "we are told these Axis prisoners, here on our own soil, the very soil they attacked, are being coddled. They receive 3 full meals. They have medical care. They sleep in warm beds. This is not justice. It is an insult to every Gold Star mother. It is a betrayal of the memory of December 7th. A sharp intake of breath came from a young lieutenant. Endo continued, "These men are our sworn enemies. To treat them with anything other than the contempt they deserve is weakness. Why are we feeding the vipers who attacked us?" He finished reading. The silence in the barracks was absolute, heavy, and toxic. "Vipers," the lieutenant spat, striking his fist against the wooden bunk. "They see. The civilians see the truth. This politeness is a lie." "It is a facade," Major Hino agreed, his face dark. "They hide their hatred behind rules. The true American is that woman. They want us dead." The consensus rippled through the group. The guards were hypocrites. Their professional calm just a mask for the deep, murderous hatred of the American populace. Kenji said nothing. He stood at the edge of the circle, his mind racing. He thought of the corporal tossing him his officer's cap. He thought of the board sergeant at roll call. He thought of Private Miller, his cold, professional gaze in the garden. The other officers saw hypocrisy. Kenji, in a sudden, blinding flash of clarity, saw something else entirely. The woman in the newspaper was right. The civilians hated them. The propaganda had been correct about that at least. But the army was not acting on that hatred. The soldiers, Miller, the sergeant, the corporal, were protecting them from that hatred. His safety was not a lie. It was a policy. It was not kindness. It was discipline. The American military was so disciplined that it would follow its own rules. This Geneva Convention, even when its own people were screaming for vengeance. They were protecting their enemy prisoners not because they liked them, but because their regulations demanded it. Kenji felt a strange, cold sensation creep up his spine. It was not fear. It was a profound, reluctant respect. This was a strength he had never been trained to fight. It was not the passion of a warrior. It was the impenetrable, impersonal strength of a system. His life was not being spared by a human whim, but by a rule book. And a rule book, he realized, was far more reliable. December 24th, 1944. Kenji knew the date only because a small calendar provided by the International YMCA was tacked to the barracks wall. In Tokyo, the date had been a growing, imported novelty, marked by glittering tinsel in the Ginza department stores. It meant little. Here, in a camp run by Americans, it was unavoidable. The very air felt different. The usual metallic tension of the compound had eased, replaced by a strange, heavy melancholy. The guards were subdued. Their orders were no less sharp, but their eyes were distant. Kenji recognized the expression. It was the universal look of a soldier miles from home during a holiday. It was the same ache he felt, just tuned to a different frequency. This shared vulnerability was, in its own way, more unsettling than the newspaper's hatred. After the evening meal, which included a surprising syrupy half of a canned peach, the prisoners were secured in their barracks. The sun dissolved and the humid air grew cool. Then the sound began. It drifted from the American barracks far across the compound, singing. It was not the boisterous, drunken carousing Kenji associated with soldiers. It was slow, melodic, and saturated with a profound sadness. Silent Night. He recognized the hymn from a Western film he had seen years ago in Asakusa. He sat on his bunk. He had spent a few minutes earlier methodically cleaning his officer's cap with a damp cloth, trying to restore some dignity to the frayed fabric. It sat beside him on the thin mattress, the only piece of his old world that remained. He listened to the enemy sing of peace, his hand resting near the symbol of his war. Major Hino spat on the floor. Singing about their holy infant while they firebomb our cities. Hypocrites! Kenji said nothing. The logic of the newspaper article returned to him. The soldiers followed the rules. The Geneva Convention permitted religious observance. This singing, the peach, it was all just another regulation being followed. It meant nothing. The singing eventually faded, replaced by the standard sounds of the night. Insects, the distant generator, the crunch of gravel. Silence was mandated after 10 o'clock. Kenji lay back, staring at the dark ceiling. He heard the rhythmic crunch of boots on the pathway outside, coming closer. A single guard, making the late patrol. The steps were precise, economical, without the shuffling laziness of some guards. He knew that cadence. It was Private Miller. The footsteps stopped directly outside Kenji's window. Kenji went rigid. He did not breathe. A patrol stopping was never good. It meant scrutiny. It meant trouble. He heard a faint scraping sound. A small, dark object slid across the wooden window ledge, which was level with his head, and came to rest with a soft thud against the barracks wall. Silence. Kenji waited for a command, for the beam of a flashlight. Nothing. After a long 10 seconds, the footsteps resumed. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Miller continued his patrol, disappearing down the line of barracks. Kenji slowly slid off his bunk. The wooden floor was cold against his bare feet. He moved to the window, staying in the shadows. He looked down at the ledge. There, stark in the weak moonlight filtering from the perimeter fence, sat a single, rectangular bar. It was a Hershey's chocolate bar, wrapped in its standard dark brown paper, the type included in Red Cross packages. He stared at it. A gift? From Miller? The Oni? The cold, disciplined soldier who had warned him away from the fence with a jerk of his chin? He thought of the woman's letter in the newspaper, calling them vipers. He thought of the other guards' indifference. This did not compute. This was not a rule. This was not policy. This was a secret. It was a breach of protocol. He did not touch it. He returned to his bunk and lay down, his heart beating a strange, unsteady rhythm. He looked from the window, where the impossible chocolate sat, to his cap, resting on the blanket. He did not eat the chocolate, but he did not throw it out into the mud. He left it there, a small, square, and agonizing riddle. The chocolate bar remained on the windowsill for 2 days, untouched. It was a dark, accusatory rectangle that Kenji could not bring himself to eat, nor could he throw away. It represented an act of individual caprice, a break in the system he had just begun to understand. The newspaper article was hatred. The Geneva Convention was cold policy. The chocolate bar, it was dangerously human. On the 3rd, morning after Christmas, the whistle shrieked into the same damp gray mist. Kenji dressed in the semi-darkness, his movements automatic. He slid his feet into his boots. He picked up his officer's cap. The small, repaired seam felt solid under his thumb. He settled it on his head, the worn leather band cool against his skin. He filed out into the morning gloom. The air was thick, smelling of damp wool and the distant salt of the Pacific. The ranks formed. Kenji took his place, his eyes automatically fixing on the mud by his feet. He had learned this was the safest place to look. It was a ritual of submission, a way to avoid inviting trouble. But his mind was not on the mud. It was on the riddle of Private Miller, the disciplined guard, the secret gift giver. Boots crunched on the gravel. Kenji tracked the sound. He recognized the cadence immediately. It was Miller. He was not on patrol. He was holding the sergeant's clipboard. He would be the one to call the names. Kenji's pulse quickened. He kept his head bowed, waiting. Tanaka. The name snapped out, crisp and professional. Kenji tensed, just as he always did. Here. Okada. Here. The roll call continued. Kenji found himself listening to the rhythm of Miller's voice. It was the same flat-board tone as the sergeant. There was no trace of the man who had left the chocolate. It was the guard from the garden, the soldier from the patrol. Maybe, Kenji thought, the chocolate was a mistake, a leftover he'd discarded. Maybe it meant nothing. Endo? Here. Miller's boots stopped. The silence stretched, suddenly taut and heavy. Kenji realized the boot tips were directly in front of him. He had not been called. He was being scrutinized. This was it. The punishment for his staring in the garden. The retribution for something. He was breathing too fast, his blood pounding in his ears. The humiliation he had been expecting for weeks was finally here. He forced his gaze upward. It was a last, defiant act. He would meet the Oni's eyes as a captain. He met the eyes of Private Miller, barely old enough to shave. The American's face was unreadable in the dim light. His eyes were not filled with hatred, nor kindness. They were just observant. And they were not looking at Kenji's face. They were fixed on the frayed brim of his officer's cap. Kenji's breath hitched. Miller's hand did not move to his baton. It did not move to shove him. It snapped upward, fingers rigid, pressed together, thumb tucked. The forearm sliced the humid air in a perfect regulation salute. It was sharp, precise, and utterly correct. It was aimed directly at the cap. Kenji stopped breathing. His mind, which had been racing, went completely, terrifyingly blank. The world dissolved. There was only the image of that hand, held steady, honoring the insignia, honoring the rank. It was not the confusing kindness of the chocolate. It was not the cold, impersonal policy of the Geneva Convention. It was honor. It was a language he understood. It was a soldier acknowledging a soldier. In that single, frozen second, the entire structure of propaganda, the posters, the speeches, the whispered warnings of demons, did not just crack. It vaporized. The salute lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Miller's hand snapped back down to his side. He made a tick on his clipboard. Hino. The private's voice was exactly as it had been before. Flat, bored. Hey, here, Major Hino stammered from beside Kenji. Miller continued down the line, his boots crunching on the gravel, calling the next name. Kenji remained standing, a statue, his entire world tilting off its axis. The walk back to the barracks was a silent, mechanical process. Kenji felt disconnected from his own body. He registered the crunch of gravel under his boots, the weight of the humid air, the distant clang of a pot from the mess hall. The sounds were thin, unreal, perceived from the bottom of a deep well. He entered the barracks and sat on his bunk. He did not remove his boots. He did not unbutton his fatigue jacket. He simply sat, his hands resting on his knees, and stared at the splintered wooden floorboards. Major Hino entered, followed by Endo. Hino was muttering, his face flushed with anger. Insolence, Hino spat, throwing his own cap onto his bunk. To mock us, to mock the rank. He thinks this is a game. Perhaps he is just young, Endo offered quietly, polishing his spectacles, though Kenji noted his hands were unsteady. A foolish gesture, meaningless. They both looked at Kenji, who had not moved. They saw his stillness, his wide, unfocused eyes. They saw a man in shock, and they mistook its cause. They assumed he was paralyzed by the humiliation Hino described. They left him alone, respecting what they perceived as his silent rage or profound shame. But Kenji felt neither. He felt hollowed out. His mind was a battlefield. The forces that had defined his entire life were in open war. On one side was the Oni, the white demon, the barbarian, the viper from the newspaper, the rapacious monster from the propaganda posters. On the other side was a young man who left secret chocolate on a windowsill. And then there was the salute. The salute was the catastrophic event. It did not fit with the demon. It did not fit with the kindness of the chocolate. It was a third, incompatible truth. It was not policy, like the Geneva Convention. It was not emotion, like the Christmas hymn. It was code. It was the language of soldiers, a language Kenji had believed his captors incapable of speaking. He sat for an hour. Then 2. The light in the barracks shifted as the sun climbed higher, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the shafts of light. His entire framework for the world was broken. He had been trained to believe the Americans were without honor, and that his own honor demanded death before capture. He had failed the second part. But the first part was a lie. He felt a slow, creeping heat rise in his chest and neck. It was shame. But it was a new and terrifying vintage of shame. He was not ashamed of being a prisoner. He was not ashamed of the salute. He was ashamed that he had believed them to be demons. He had misjudged his enemy so completely, so fundamentally, that it called everything else into question. If he was wrong about this, what else was he wrong about? His fingers twitched. He needed an anchor. He needed something real. Slowly his hand moved to the officer's cap, which he still wore. His fingers found the brim. He lifted it from his head. He held it in his lap, turning it over. The light from the window caught the tarnished metal star. He saw the frayed fabric. His thumb found the small, uneven line of stitches he had made weeks ago, repairing the seam. Private Miller had not saluted him. The prisoner, the viper, the enemy. He had saluted this object, this symbol of rank. Kenji's breath caught in his throat. This cap was no longer the emblem of his failure. It was the emblem of his identity, an identity that a 19-year-old American private, raised to hate him, had been disciplined enough to recognize. They were not Oni. They were not monsters. They were just soldiers. He sat motionless as the realization settled over him, cold and heavy as stone. If they were just soldiers, following their own code, then what did that make his side? What did that make the war? The salute changed the nature of Kenji's observation. Before, he had watched his captors with the tense focus of a prey animal. Now, he watched them with the analytical, agonizing curiosity of a scientist who has just seen his life's work proven false. He watched Private Miller during the morning roll calls. The young guard was exactly as he had been before. Professional, cold, efficient. The salute was never repeated. It had been a singular event, a lightning strike that had illuminated the landscape and then vanished, leaving Kenji to navigate the new alien terrain. The chocolate bar had been a casualty of this new world. 2 days after the salute, Kenji had taken the unwrapped, slightly melted bar from the sill and thrown it into the latrine pit. It was too complex. The salute was honor. He could process that. The chocolate was something else. Kindness, pity, or a whim, and he was not ready for it. He needed facts, not feelings. He had heard the other officers mention it, usually with contempt. The library. It was a small plywood hut at the far end of the compound, near the chapel, maintained by the International YMCA. Major Hino scoffed at it. Books filled with their lies, he'd said, poison for a weak mind. Kenji, whose mind now felt terrifyingly weak, or perhaps terrifyingly open, found himself drawn to it. He needed to know. If the Oni had a code of honor, what other truths was he missing? He went in the late afternoon, when the tropical heat was at its peak and most prisoners were napping or sequestered in the shade. He left his officer's cap on his bunk. This was not an act of a captain. This was a private, shameful pilgrimage. He slipped into the hut. The air inside was still and hot, thick with the smell of old paper, mildew, and cheap glue. It was a single room, lined with mismatched shelves holding perhaps 200 books. A few bare bulbs hung from the ceiling. It was empty. His eyes scanned the spines. Many were Bibles. There were stacks of donated magazines, Life and the Saturday Evening Post, filled with bright, smiling advertisements that seemed obscene. There were farming manuals and stacks of paperback westerns. And then, on a low shelf, he saw it. A thick, blue-bound book with a faded gold title. A Basic History of the United States. He reached for it, his hand hesitating. This was the source code. This was the book that explained the men who left chocolate bars and saluted the enemy. He felt a profound sense of transgression, as if he were touching a sacred forbidden text. He pulled it from the shelf. It was heavy. The floorboard by the door creaked. Kenji flinched, his heart leaping into his throat. He spun around, clutching the book to his chest, feeling like a traitor caught in the act. Private Miller stood in the doorway. He was not in his full guard rig. His helmet and rifle were gone. He wore just his fatigue shirt, the sleeves rolled up, showing pale, freckled arms. He looked even younger without his gear, just a boy. He was holding his own book, a small dog-eared novel. Miller stopped, clearly as surprised as Kenji. His eyes dropped from Kenji's face to the blue history book Kenji was holding. Kenji braced himself for the order, the laugh, the accusation. Miller's expression did not change. He offered no salute. They were not at roll call. He simply gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a greeting. It was just an acknowledgement. I see you. You are here. Then Miller walked past him, his boots quiet on the wooden floor. He went to the shelf of westerns, swapped his book for another, and sat down at one of the two small tables. He opened the new book and began to read, immediately lost in its world. Kenji stood paralyzed for a full minute. He had been seen, and nothing had happened. He looked at Miller, a soldier who, off-duty, read novels, just as Kenji had done in Tokyo. He turned, the heavy history book still pressed against his ribs. He did not sit. He walked out of the library, back into the glaring sunlight, his mind quiet. He had the book. He had his mission. He would learn. The months following Kenji's visit to the library had been a period of quiet, internal revolution. He spent every spare hour with the blue history book, parsing the difficult English, a small dictionary, also from the library, at his side. He learned of a nation founded on a defiant declaration of individual rights, a concept so alien to his own upbringing that it took weeks to simply grasp the premise. He learned of their civil war, a conflict that had torn them apart over the very definitions of freedom. He saw their contradictions, their failures, and their stubborn, repeated attempts to adhere to their own founding ideals. He began to understand the rule book that governed Private Miller. It was not just a military code, it was a national one. His officer's cap, which he still wore to roll call, remained a symbol of his rank, but the book had become the symbol of his education. Then, August 15th, 1945, arrived like a physical blow. The prisoners were assembled in the central yard, not for roll call, but for a special announcement. The camp commandant, a Colonel Kenji had rarely seen, stood on the steps of the administrative building. He read from a shortwave radio transcript, the voice of the emperor. The war was over. Japan had surrendered unconditionally. The announcement was met with a terrifying absolute silence. When they were dismissed, they walked back to the barracks not as soldiers, but as ghosts. Kenji entered the long, hot room. The air was thick, unbreathable. Then the silence broke. Major Hino sat on his bunk, his back rigid, weeping without a sound, tears of profound, bottomless shame cutting paths through the dust on his cheeks. Two lieutenants in the far corner began a low, ritualistic chant. Lieutenant Sato, a young, fiery officer from Kyushu, suddenly screamed. It was a sound of pure negation. It is a lie, a trick of the enemy. The Emperor would never. It is true, Kenji said, his voice quiet, but it cut through the rising hysteria. Sato turned on him. You read their poison. You are weak. You are not Japanese. Death is our only honor. Sato's eyes darted around the room, wild and broken. He saw Private Miller, who had been posted at the doorway with another guard, rifles held at the ready, anticipating exactly this reaction. You, Sato whispered, his voice cracking. You did this. With a guttural roar, Sato grabbed the wooden stool from beside his bunk and raised it, lunging toward the doorway. Halt! Miller shouted, snapping his rifle to his shoulder, the bolt clicking. The other guard did the same. Sato-san! Yamero! Kenji's voice was a blade, a command sharp with the authority of his rank. Sato froze, his arm high, the stool trembling. He was caught between his captain and the American rifles. Kenji walked slowly from the center of the room, placing himself directly between Sato and Miller. He looked first at Sato. It is finished, he said in Japanese. There is no more honor in this, only death. Sato's face crumpled in agony. There is nothing left. No, Kenji said. He turned very slowly to face Private Miller. Miller's rifle was level, aimed not at Kenji, but at Sato, just behind him. The private's face was pale, his knuckles white on the stock. He was ready to fire. Kenji looked at the soldier. He did not speak. He did not plead. He calmly, deliberately reached up with both hands. His fingers touched the frayed brim of his officer's cap. He lifted it from his head. He held it in his hands, this last symbol of his old world, the object Miller had honored with a salute. Then, holding the cap to his chest, Kenji executed a slow, deep, formal bow. It was not a bow of surrender. It was not a bow of defeat. It was the bow of a soldier, acknowledging the end, acknowledging the man who had shown him honor. He straightened up, still holding his cap, his eyes meeting Miller's. He saw the recognition in the young American's face. The tension in Miller's shoulders eased. His finger moved from the trigger. The barrel of his rifle dipped just an inch toward the floor. The immediate crisis was over. The violence had been stopped, not by a bullet, but by an idea. Kenji stood in the silence, the cap in his hands, no longer a prisoner of war, but simply a man, ready for whatever came next.